Hey everyone, this is PK Entertainment and we are back again, and here now we have another video for you, and this will be a review of Batman The Long Halloween Part 2. Now the second of this two-part installment began in Part 1, released on June the 22nd, 2021, and continues the adaptation of the comic book storyline created by Jeff Loeb and drawn by Tim Sale, released from 1996 to 1997. Now you can check out my review of Part 1 on the channel, and I will leave a link within the description. Part 2 was released digitally and on Blu-ray, release on July the 27th, 2021. So just recapping briefly on Part 1, it covered Batman working together with Harvey Dent and Captain Gordon to track down a serial killer who was taking out various criminal figures on the biggest holidays throughout the year. So the setup within Part 2 is that we continue with the holiday killer who still looms large, taking out various criminal figures as with Part 1, but the story really shifts its focus much more on the emergence of Batman's most classic villains causing chaos within Gotham. We see Falcone struggling to re-strengthen his criminal empire following the murders from Part 1. And we essentially get the final stages of the Two-Face origin that was set out earlier on within the first installment. Now overall, I'll say this was a superior installment to Part 1, primarily because there were a lot more characters involved, which results in the story being a lot more eventful, more action-packed and more livelier overall. There is a certain poise and sophistication in the cinematography, the animation and the scene setting overall, and like the first film, it still feels smaller in scale despite the inclusion of more villain characters. Now despite the story itself, it still feels very unessential when all is said and done. The story feels all too familiar. There are certain scenes and sequences that we've seen multiple times done in various other Batman adaptations and done better, I think, overall. In particular, there are far echoes of scenes from both The Dark Knight and Batman Begins. The holiday killer storyline itself really gets sidelined for far more focus on the Two-Face origin and other villains, and to me it makes you realise that the holiday storyline definitely wasn't strong enough to warrant two movies, and the narrative had to be padded out by including more villains whose presence really wasn't necessary to the overall plot. Now even if you haven't read the source material, it does become obvious halfway through this movie who the identity of the killer is, and when it's revealed, it's done in such an understated way that you feel quite shortchanged in the fact that you've had to sit through two 1 hour and 20-minute movies in order to find out who the killer was. Now in terms of Batman himself, to me he came off less competent as a crime fighter. As Part 1, it was very hinted that he wasn't quite the prime detective that we all know him to be, but in this movie he wasn't really the prime crime fighter that we normally associate with the character. There are multiple times when Catwoman makes these last minute efforts in order to save Batman, and the film makes Batman and Catwoman kind of more of a crime fighting duo. Now we do get a further revelation involving Catwoman, but it's brought in so late in the movie. Like the holiday killer, it's done in such an understated fashion that you really wonder why it was included in the first place. Now the Two-Face narrative is done very well, and unlike various other adaptations, it's done primarily very faithful to the source material, but we've seen the Two-Face origin done so many times before, so it doesn't really feel fresh or invigorating when we see the eventual story plan out. I also wouldn't get too excited about the appearance of various other classic villains, as most of them feel really disposable overall, and you wonder why would they really include it in the overall storyline. They've got no real overall purpose in terms of the main story of this film. Now as with Part 1, yes, there is some R-rated violence, and I think there's really only one F-bomb throughout, but it's nothing really too much to really shout about, particularly if you become accustomed to the kind of more adult orientated violence that we've seen so often throughout the DC animated movies. There also is an end credit scene at the end. It's nothing too particular. I think it's just done more as a token gesture rather than leading into anything going forward in terms of the future DC animated properties. So if I had to give an overall score for the Batman The Long Halloween Part 2, I would give it a 6.4 out of 10. As I mentioned before, it is superior to the first movie. It's very well produced, very mature animation, more eventful, more involving, but the story feels underwhelming like the first part. And having watched both movies now, I'm absolutely in no doubt whatsoever that this should have been condensed into one singular movie, 1 hour and 20 minutes overall. Two films just wasn't required, and it ends up dragging out a lot of the plot narratives, and as I mentioned before, they really had to include a lot of people in the second movie in order to pad it out. And really, when we look at the two set movies overall, it really is lopsided towards the last and end. And the first movie easily could have been condensed down and tacked on to this movie for a 1 hour and 20 movie. And I don't really think this is an essential piece when we talk about the DC animated movies. It definitely is nowhere near as good as Batman The Dark Knight Returns or Under the Red Hood. I wouldn't put it anywhere near as close as those titles. And I just feel elements in this story have been told far better, and to be honest, I would rather go back to watching Batman the Animated Series and episodes within that show again rather than coming to this movie overall. Now, if this is indeed a faithful adaptation, then I don't see why the source material is so revered overall. I had the same thoughts after watching both The Killing Joke and Hush as well, and it does make me wonder as to whether these comic book storylines are truly great as what everybody makes out them to be. Are they really being overhyped because fans are excited in seeing them being translated to live action overall? I'll just take a stock of pause really just to wonder, going forward, how faithful should DC be in adapting these storylines? Should they be even more faithful, or should they be even less faithful and try going for more original storylines? Because at the moment I'm not seeing it. After this movie and previous films overall, as I mentioned before, I'm not seeing exactly the whole thrill behind why these comic book storylines are so speculated and hyped up. But again, many people will disagree with me in terms of that overall statement. So those are my thoughts and feelings and review on Batman The Long Halloween Part 2. Let me know what you think in the comments below. How do you think it compared in Part 1 overall? Do you think the same as me and feel that both Part 1 and 2 should have been condensed into one singular movie? How do you think this movie compares to other previous efforts within the DC animated universe, as I mentioned before? Are you still a fan of the art style that we've seen very much consistent throughout the likes of Superman, Man of Tomorrow, and Batman Son of Dragon, as well as The Long Halloween Part 1 as well? Would you like to see more variety and diversity in terms of the overall art style? And would you like to see them to adapt much more of the comic book source material art style overall? And are you looking forward to the next adaptation, which is the Injustice storyline? And I don't think there's been a confirmed date yet, but I'm sure a trailer is coming up very soon as well. So when we get trailers for that, I will review those as well. Please also hit and like those subscription and notification buttons so I can provide you with more high quality content like this in the future. But that's it for now. Take care of yourselves, stay at safe distances, and I will see you very, very soon.